So much. I hope you all had a wonderful field trip, whether it's the KGB Museum, the TV tower, or the old city tour, but I'm glad that you all made your way back here. My name is Ali Aslan. I'm a Berlin-based television presenter and journalist, and it's my great pleasure to be moderating this very wonderful, very pertinent, very timely panel. Of course, just a month ago, we celebrated the 70th anniversary of NATO in Washington, D.C. Not sure if it was much of a celebration, but it was marked, the 70th anniversary. And I think since this is one of the preeminent security conferences in Europe, it's only apt that we talk about the state of the alliance. And I'll do that to my immediate left. He is the Assistant Secretary General for Defense Investment at NATO. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Camille Grons is here with us. Right next to him, a very familiar face, of course, a very important voice in German foreign policy. He's a member of the German Bundestag for the Liberal Party, for the FDP. Alexander Graf Lambsdorff is here, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much.
No Lena conference would be complete without this lady to my right.
This is going well.
She is no pressure at all. No, always great to see her. Wonderful to see her. Right now, she's a Robert Bosch Senior Fellow at Brookings Institution. Constanze Stelzmüller, ladies and gentlemen. And joining us from Poland, a country that certainly has very important contributions and perspectives on our topic on NATO. He's the director of the Warsaw office of the German Marshall Fund. Great to see him. Michael Baranowski is here, ladies and gentlemen. Now, Camille Grons, as I said, 70th anniversary of NATO, very important event, very important year. I asked Rose Gottemeller at the Munich Security Conference during our panel what she deemed to be the greatest accomplishment and achievement of NATO in 70 years. And she said it's adaptability, the fact that it has been able to adapt throughout various crises and events. What would your answer be? What is NATO's greatest achievement looking back 70 years?
Of course, if we look back 70 years, the fact that NATO has been able to preserve peace in Europe has been its greatest achievement and remains, I think, a matter of pride for all of us. And this is something that needs to be obviously continued. But I would concur with Rose's point on adaptability, because if I look more in the last 5-7 years, indeed, our ability to transform NATO and to adapt NATO has been quite astonishing. And many of us who were looking at NATO in 2014 would have been surprised today by the achievements that we've done in the last 6 or 7 years over time, since maybe a little before the Ukraine crisis, but primarily since the Ukraine crisis. And the fact that this alliance has been, over a fairly short period of time, able to really in a way reinvent itself. And I would argue that the transformation we've seen in the last 5 years that have been somewhat overshadowed by some of the politics around the transatlantic alliance, I think are worthwhile mentioning, in the sense that if we had said 5 years ago that we would have enhanced forward presence in the Baltic states and Poland, that we would have had the largest exercise in the alliance history last year with Trident Juncture, that we would completely review our deterrence and defense posture, that we would stay united in light of the INF crisis, of the Ukraine crisis. I think all of this is quite an achievement that we should always keep to mind, and including one element of, I guess, today's conversation, which is the enhanced NATO-EU relationship, which is also one of the achievements of the last few years.
Indeed, and we will, of course, go much more into detail about that. But let's look back just briefly. Let's do a quick round about the achievements of NATO, about what it stood for 7 decades. Alexander Graf Lambsdorff, what stands out to you? What is NATO's greatest achievement up until now?
It's Atlantic security. It's keeping the Americans in. That's, I think, the alpha and the omega. Without the Americans being present in Europe throughout the decades, I don't know whether we could have kept the peace. I don't know whether the Russians could have been kept out. I don't know whether we could have achieved first German, then European unification. It is the transatlantic link that I think is what is NATO's DNA in a way. And its importance has only become clearer by some of the statements of the current US president in the course of the campaign and afterwards, putting into question NATO's relevance. And I think that has focused everybody's mind on the importance of this link. In Der Spiegel of last week, there was an article of what Europeans would have to shoulder if the Americans were indeed withdrawing from NATO. It makes for shocking reading. So I think the biggest achievement really is coupling American and European security and keeping it that way.
Keeping America in NATO for 70 years. We don't have an American on the panel. We have many in the audience, and I'd be happy to call upon them later on. We don't have any American on the panel, but Constanze Stelzenmüller, being representative of...
I'm your proxy American.
I
knew this was going. This is where we were heading.
As Brookings Institution, you will be allowed today to wear the American hat. But of course, the same question goes out to you as someone who knows the transatlantic alliance very well. NATO 70 years.
Sure.
What stands out to you?
Right. Well, I mean, many of you know that I used to be a journalist, and I've actually covered NATO operations in Afghanistan and in the Balkans. And I think that while those have receded from public debate in America and Europe, while we seem to be pondering withdrawal, I would say that we played a huge role in bringing peace to the Balkans and peace to Afghanistan. I mean, arguably we made a lot of mistakes as well, but I remember very vividly going to Kabul in January 2002 and meeting people who were just couldn't believe their luck at having survived the Taliban. But that's one point. My main point is just to perhaps build on what Alexander just said, which is that without NATO, we would not have been able to end the Cold War peacefully.
Exactly.
And we would not have had the framework in which to have a peaceful dissolution of the Soviet Union and a democratic transformation of the Eastern European former Warsaw Pact and Soviet Union states, and them joining the EU and NATO. If that's not a generational miracle, I don't know what is.
So very much reason to celebrate.
Absolutely.
Without
Absolutely.
NATO, the Cold War would have never come to an end as peacefully as it did, says Constanze Stelzenmüller. A Cold War that ended and that brought Poland, of course, then within NATO and on its side. Michael Baranowski, as someone who works for the German Marshall Fund but is based in Warsaw, knows the scene very well. What's the mood in Poland right now when you look at 70 years back of NATO? Because you haven't been part of all of it, obviously.
Exactly. So we are relatively new kids on the block, right? We are celebrating 20 years of Poland's, Czech Republic's, Hungary's membership. There are other countries that, Romania and others that joined 15 years ago. Look, for us, this was the breaking of the Yalta system, where we were just denied the freedom and opportunities that the rest of Europe was benefiting from. This was NATO's enlargement. Poland joining NATO was beginning of political and economic transformation, in a sense that it then led to our membership in the European Union. Between EU and NATO membership, we were able to grow, transform Europe into what we have right now. But I would also point out to what Camille brought forward. So the adaptation since 2014. I mean, we enlarged NATO. We joined NATO with the hope that we'll never have to use it again. That this is going to be more of a political club for us, worrying though in the back of our minds that Russians might change their trajectory of what many people in the West hoped to be joining or somehow being not an adversarial neighbor. And we have done a lot since 2014. We are not done. Russia has not stopped modernizing. I'm sure we'll talk about this, but I think the last 5 years is also something that we can see with success, even though that more needs to be done.
And now that we've looked fondly back at 70 years and NATO's achievements and the justified praise that went along with it, let's look at the current state. Let's look at the current state of NATO. Camille Grand, obviously, Alexander Graf Lambsdorff has already alluded to it. The current occupant of the White House is not a big fan of NATO. I think he's made it abundantly clear. And without America, there is no NATO. There is no such alliance. Do you see problems ahead for the alliance? How do we bring this American president? How do we make him understand the importance of this alliance?
Honestly, when I look at the situation, and I was, as many of you, in Washington for the 70th anniversary, I think it was quite impressive, the situation. And I would say, of course, we focused on the defense ministerial, which marked the 70th anniversary, which was the formal celebration, and that went well. In a way, some in the press said it was boring, but in a way, boring is good from that perspective because it was working and delivering, and the fact that it went well is in itself a very important thing. The second thing which was very important in that process was the fact that there was the speech by the Secretary General in front of the US Congress, which was a very impressive and moving moment, honestly, being in the room, to see the sort of overwhelming support coming from both sides of the aisle in Congress, and a very, very incredible sign of support by the American Congress to that. And next to that, there was also a fairly lengthy bilateral meeting between the Secretary General and President Trump, which also went well and was very substantive. So in a way, I think from that perspective, we're in a much better position than we were, and when there were lots of debates on that a couple of years ago, when the president was coming in, had made comments during the campaign. The reality of the American commitment to European security is here, and in a way, the European deterrence initiative has been not only implemented but has been enhanced in the recent past. In the last couple of years, we've seen more US presence in Europe and an increased US presence in Europe compared to the situation a few years ago. So from that perspective, I think the transatlantic bond in security is strong, and no matter the disputes that exist in other domains, in the security field, we have something that is quite robust, and that is.
So what are you saying? You're saying don't focus on the Twitter feeds, focus on the deeds.
That's an easy way to say it. But the way I would put it is that, first of all, when it comes to the presidential statements, there are also lots of very strong statements by Trump himself on NATO that have taken place next to the tweets. The second thing, which I think is very important, is that yes, indeed, focus on the deeds, but also note that some of the issues which are transatlantic disputes, like trade and others, have not spilled over on NATO, and we are in a situation where the alliance is rather stronger in terms of what we are doing than it was a few years ago. So from that perspective, I think we are on a trajectory where the US commitment to European security is there, and the recognition by the Europeans that it's important to work with the Americans to preserve European security and European stability is there. And what's interesting is when pushed to shelves with specific crises, like when the violation of the INF Treaty became a central thing, the alliance did stick together and is on joining forces and quite united.
Alexander Graf Lambsdorff, you of course are reaching across the aisle. You're talking to your American counterparts, your American colleagues continuously. Is the fading enthusiasm for NATO, is this something that is very particular to this US president, or do you even feel it among senators, among congressmen, amongst politicians, or even amongst the public in the US?
No, it's quite interesting what Camille just said. I mean, the speech by the Secretary General in front of both houses of Congress, that is something that's very remarkable. So you have a particular outlook from the White House, which I think is gradually changing, and indeed deeds, not tweets, is a very nice way of putting it. And there is a strong American military presence in Europe, going up, not going down. But politically speaking, words matter, the tweets matter too. And so to get this very strong support, this very strong signal from the Congress on a continuous basis, I think is remarkable and is positive. And you could see it in the Munich Security Conference. Munich had the largest CODEL ever this year, which I find reassuring and positive. However, having said all that, I want us to go back to yesterday's opening panel when Ursula von der Leyen, the German Minister of Defense, sat here and said something very interesting, and I want us to make a little intellectual exercise. She said, if we didn't have NATO, we would have to invent it. And then ask yourselves,
fully with that.
whether your country would sign up to a treaty like the North Atlantic Treaty. Would Germany sign up to it? What would our debate be about the military commitment to the security of Estonia or Poland? What would the Italian and what would the American or the Turkish debate be? So what I think is really important is that we keep investing politically in this alliance, also beyond sort of the people who work on this day in, day out, who have a strategic outlook, a strategic perspective. Congress is a very good place. They are doing what is theirs. I mean, they really signal their support, but we need to do it in Europe as well. We need to go to our political audiences, to the publics, by and large, to underscore the value of NATO for European security.
So the campaign to bring NATO closer to the people and its significance and importance is all across the continent, not just an American issue. But Constanze Schelsmüller, I still want to ask you about America and its perspective on NATO. You are based in Washington. You talk to people. Give us your sense.
Okay, thank you. I realized this was heading my way. For one, I was at the same event as you guys were. I went to the speech that Stoltenberg gave to the joint session of Congress, which was very impressive. He got a standing ovation after about, on average, every third sentence. And it was basically like doing La Ola in a football stadium. I mean, we were doing this all the time. And it was quite moving. It was a really good speech. It was very warm, and it was very well received. And there was this moment at the end where he paused and said, very meaningfully, "It's good to have friends." Right. Yeah, and got a huge line of applause for that. But it was very clear that Congress was making it clear to the White House and to Vice President Pence, who was sitting behind Nancy Pelosi in the top seat, that there was no way that Congress was going to tolerate any removal from NATO. Remember also that there was a bill passed in the House at, I don't know the numbers exactly, 537 to 22. For sure, I only know the 22. Voting to deny any kind of funding for a NATO withdrawal. The 22 who voted against were the Freedom Caucus, to which the Secretary of State belongs. That is important. Congress knew exactly why it was dramatizing this event. And if you went to the think tank event afterwards at the Anthem, where Mike Pence gave a speech, which was a lot colder, and which sort of called out Germany and Turkey for reasons with which I at least partially personally agree with, but in ways that were sort of, much harsher, you got a much better sense of what was actually going on. And I have to say to you that I am actually profoundly concerned about the state of the alliance. Everything that Alexander Lambsdorff and Camille Grand have said is true. But the larger context is profoundly concerning, and if we don't talk about that, we miss the entire picture. And the larger context is that we have an administration that is, having a very unclear conversation about the future of Iran. I'm putting it very carefully here. That has mooted very publicly withdrawal from Syria and Afghanistan, and then has been forced to walk back from that, but in ways which arguably make the situation for Western coalition forces in Syria and Afghanistan much less secure. Some of you will have read the scathing piece by Brett McGurk, the former Syria envoy, castigating this decision. Then you have, on a second level, a policy of weaponizing economic interdependence, tariffs and sanctions, used with gay abundance, frankly, in ways that I think more regularly let adversaries off the hook. Remember Rusal, remember ZTE, and have a secondary impact on allies that is very significant. And finally, you have events like last week's reception of Viktor Orban in the White House, which I think cast a chill over many of us living in Washington. And I think that is true also for many of my American friends, and I think many who are in this room today. And this context, I think, makes life for NATO very, very difficult. And I completely agree with both of you, and I suspect with Michael as well, that we as Europeans ought to be doing much more to hold up our side of the bargain. But we have to see that we are now in an environment of great power competition where our American partner, for the very first time, isn't quite clear about its role in the international order.
quite clear. You made your concern about the future of this alliance and its current state quite clear. Of course, I'm going to give you a chance to respond to just that. But Michael Baranovsky, would you share that assessment? Is the alliance in a state of a crisis?
So, you see, we are all, as we are sitting here, I would say cheerleaders for stronger NATO, stronger transatlantic relations, but we should also talk about its problems. I mean, for Poland, regardless of where you sit in the political spectrum, NATO is absolutely fundamental. It's both political and civilizational choice, and of course critical for our security. I would echo everything that Camille said about the importance of the stronger military presence that we have actually seen also from the American side on the ground with the increased spending for the deterrence initiative, European deterrence initiative. Now the Polish government is finishing also negotiating the increased US presence in Poland, aka for Trump. We can come back to this. But there is more Americans coming, and that's good. But there, of course, we have very different perceptions of what's going on in Washington, D.C. from different European capitals. I'm struck when I travel to Paris that I hear a lot about strategic autonomy. In Berlin, I've heard so far, and from Minister von der Leyen, I think we've heard more direction of a strategic patience, though sometimes Foreign Minister Heiko Maas talks a little bit more about strategic autonomy as well. And in Warsaw, you have very deep strategic embrace of the United States. So you really have very different perspectives. And we talked a lot about the things that worry us on the White House side, on the American side, but I think we also need to mention the issues that are on our side of the pond, because politically NATO is not as strong as we would all, I think, like to see it. We've mentioned credibility of the U.S. We should talk about Germany's military spending. Nord Stream 2 is part of this discussion as well, right? And in the end, when we sit in Warsaw, what we are really worried about is actually how bad the US-German relations and German-US relations are going, because we actually need someone to be behind us, not to be connected only directly with Washington.
And Alexander Graf Lambsdorff will get a chance in just a moment, of course, to address exactly the German question, something that's very much on the mind of the U.S. president. But coming on, strategic autonomy, something that comes up quite a bit. Kersti Kaljulaid yesterday in her dinner speech also talked about the relevance of PESCO. Ursula von der Leyen reiterated it here on stage as well. Up until now, PESCO, of course, launched in 2017, a bit of a precursor to an EU army, some say. The US, the Americans don't like it. They make it abundantly clear they've criticized this undertaking. What's your take?
Well, on this, I think we have to be, we have to try to break down the problem. Mm-hmm. One thing, which is the sort of good news story, is that when we are having these recurring debate on burden sharing, the fact that the Europeans are putting their act together, investing more into defense, is, as the President said yesterday, as every European leader has said in the last few years, a good news, because this means that the European Union is bringing, and the Europeans collectively and nationally are bringing more to the table. They increase defense spending, and it's that might seem a bit, if you look at the figures in the military balance, it's quite fascinating to see that Europe is the fastest growing defense budgets in the world last year. This is where there was the largest increase in defense spending in Western Europe is last year. So things are happening on this front when it comes to burden sharing. And the EU can take its share of that effort. It needs to be well organized with NATO, but I'll take a couple of examples there. One is which I find a great success story, even though it's still work in progress, is the effort on military mobility, where you see the European Commission putting together money from funds that are dedicated to civilian infrastructure to meet some NATO requirements to enable moving forces around Europe very quickly. This should mean $1 billion a year spent by the European Commission on facilitating military mobility across Europe. This is an excellent news. Then, next to that, there are projects which are more contentious in a transatlantic context. The European Defence Fund, PESCO, have been recently harshly criticized by the US side with a concern, which I can understand, on what it means in terms of opening markets and things like that. And on the other hand, the EU is claiming, well, this is a contribution to burden sharing. This is something that we are doing and that is bringing things to the table. I think there, the devil is in the detail, and what we need to do is to make sure that those efforts are consistent with what NATO is doing and bring added value and added money to this necessary effort. And then there is a sort of issue with the words we use when we discuss European defense. And there, I must admit that on the part of all European leaders, there is a tendency to a form of loose talk. You know, when the concept of European army pops up a bit randomly, and in France, in Germany, in Brussels, you know, and it's not very poorly defined. Strategic autonomy is official wording in EU text, so it's not it's a concept that has made its way into EU policies, but it's again rather poorly defined. Is strategic autonomy about the Europeans being able to act on their own when the Americans are not willing or able to do something, or is it about doing as a principle things without the Americans? And there, you know, you really need to sort of go into the details of that in order to have a proper conversation. And honestly, I don't think we're there yet. And I think we were, that form of what I call a loose talk doesn't necessarily help, because it triggers a reaction across Europe and across the Atlantic that are not necessarily helpful for the alliance.
So at a rather preliminary stage, let's see where this is headed.
I'm essentially an optimist on that, because I've seen, and at NATO we see the value that those efforts on the EU side can bring to the table, but I think there is also a need to be very precise and have a deep conversation between both organizations to make sure that we are consistent and coherent in our efforts.
Alexander Graf Lambsdorff, Germany is one of the favorite recipients of Donald Trump's criticism when it comes particularly to the magical 2% threshold that's coming up. Germany's not doing its part, is not fulfilling its obligation, as was agreed by the 2014 Wales agreement. Even those who are not fans of the US president concur. They say on this particular subject matter, he's actually right. He's right to point out that Germany is not playing its part. Is he right?
Are you saying that people in Germany concur?
Generally, it's not about the people in Germany. I'm saying.
I think a majority. I mean, I happen to concur, but the majority in Germany clearly does not.
Yeah. But Europe-wide?
Me personally?
No, Europe-wide people concur, no, with this particular notion that Germany is not doing enough.
I mean, the reason why people don't concur with the US president on this is, first of all, that we have to fight climate change, which costs a lot of money. That we have to strive for social justice, i.e. Enlarging our pension system to new groups of recipients, that we have to get our education system off the ground and move forward on digitization.
But other countries need to do that as well. It's not a German...
Yes, I'm just giving you the reality of the German political debate. And that there is a constant effort by the German government. I have a bit of a dilemma here. I'm here sitting here as a member of the German Bundestag, but of an opposition party. So I'm a bit hard pressed to. There's Christian who will speak a little later.
Yes, he's taking diligent notes.
He's already taking notes, and the ambassador somewhere too. So, but no, the point being is, the majority of the German public does not want to spend 2% on defense, full stop.
Right.
Now, the German government is constantly advocating, at least 1.5. We'll make it 1.5. Right. Chancellor Merkel said so much in Munich. The minister said so much here yesterday. Right. We will not get to 1.5. The midterm financial planning sees defense spending for the coming year at 1.37 and then going down again to 1.25. So we're sliding backwards again. And personally, I believe, having said what I've said earlier, that NATO is crucial, that we need NATO, that European security depends on a successful NATO. I believe that the German position on that is wrong, but I cannot promise to you, and Christian observes us here, so I cannot promise that even if we enter government, that this will change, because it's a profoundly unpopular suggestion to do anything that Mr. Trump thinks should be done.
What about Mr. Putin?
But the two, I mean, this, just to say, I mean, the 2014 Wells Agreement, Donald Trump was still doing his Apprentice show on television.
Yeah, but
so,
that's ancient history.
Yeah,
That is ancient.
but it's an agreement.
Ali, but that it was signed by a social democratic minister at the time, but the social democrats now are blocking it completely, full front and center. And I can only encourage all social democrats who believe in NATO, who are from other countries than Germany, to come to Berlin and talk to your social democratic counterparts, because social democrats have a key role to play. They are part of government, but their audience, I mean, their electorate is going to the Greens and to the hard left, who are completely against this. And so, you know, to support them in supporting the alliance, I think, is a valuable task.
Well, I appreciate your honesty. I mean, you don't succumb to a political answer. You're actually giving it to us straight. And I know that my right side is itching to get back, but come, you go on. You want to take this right away.
No, let me just jump into this defense spending debate. I think the characterization of the 2% pledge being and I know you didn't say that, but there is this perception that this is all about pleasing Trump. I don't think this is the issue. I think this is an issue of A, fair burden sharing amongst the allies, 2, taking into account, and for me that's the prime driver, the reality of the strategic environment, which has changed dramatically. 3, the fact that we really need, this money is making a difference. Just for a second, look at Russia. The Russian budget has tripled in the last 20 years. That has created an ability of Russia to do things that they were not able to do 20 years ago. They have modernized, and what they've demonstrated in Syria, in Crimea, and elsewhere proves that spending money on defense enables you to do more things. Not that I'm suggesting that that's what Germany should go into.
I fully agree with you, but then the Americans need to be clear about one other thing. If Europe wants to be able to bear its part of the burden successfully, we as Europeans have to work together much more closely than we have in the past. We cannot simply, take a larger responsibility, be more efficient on procurement, spend more on defense without moving together more closely. And that's where PESCO and all these things come in. So the Americans cannot ask us to do more and then complain about us doing more. That does not work. And I think that is something that we need to convey in DC.
Constanze Schelsmüller, to spend more on defense in Germany is a very, very unpopular task and pitch, says Alexander Graf Lambsdorff. You know this, of course. How do we overcome this?
Okay, a couple of things here. I mean, I think this has been a really fascinating discussion, and I'm also grateful.
Well, you're part of it. So.
I'm grateful. I've been grateful to Alexander for his frankness. And I think that's important in describing what the German public debate is like. The question, of course, for us as people who are sort of, if you will, intermediaries, is how can we help change this, the perceptions and the debate? You as a legislator, even if you are in the opposition, people like us as experts who opinionate. And I would say, let's take up this question asked by Ursula von der Leyen, what would we be doing if we didn't have NATO? How would we organize European defense? And I think the truth would be, if you look at, if you assumed, and we're actually not very far from this political reality right now, if you assumed that America had retreated to an offshore balancer position and was saying, we'll come in if there's anything really serious, major war, that kind of thing. But otherwise, you're on your own. Crisis management, you should really be able to do this. And frankly, that is actually the foundation for the conversations about PESCO. It's not about replacing NATO. It's about doing small to medium-sized operations of crisis management in the European periphery. That is an entirely legitimate request to make of us. Any president could and should, and we ought to be answering with a resounding yes. But some of you will have seen that IISS has just published a study pricing out scenarios of what that would mean. And doing the numbers for this and making it clear that all of us would be paying much higher defense budgets than we are now. In other words, the 2% come really cheap. And they come cheap because we free ride on the Americans. And if we want to be able to do certain things on our own, then we have to think about how to configure European forces in a way that we can pay for and that is effective. And what that means is for the big three, the UK, France, and Germany, to provide the backbone for this kind of operations in the way that the Americans had to in Libya because we weren't able to, as became clear after 3 days. And then configure the smaller European countries' militaries around that. The nasty truth of European defense is, as we all know, that even the big three have not been able to afford full spectrum forces for more than a decade. We don't have that, and it's because of technology costs. Yeah, and because, of course, as nation states, we've made choices between public welfare expenditures and defense expenditures, which the Americans, to some degree, allowed us to make. But this is where the complication is. The costs would be much, much higher without the Americans, and we have to be honest with our own publics and our own electorates about what the cost of European security and some autonomy will be.
Chair Baranowski, you've been taking diligent notes. I know you have a thing or two to say about this and about the burden sharing. You brought it up.
First of all, I agree with Constanza that this is a fascinating debate.
You're part of it. I'm glad you enjoy it.
But where I do, when Constanza talks about U.S. strategy of offshore balancing, first, I disagree that this is where we are. And if we were there, it would make me want to move out from the neighborhood.
I'm
and certainly from
where
this,
we might be heading.
Well,
not where we are.
So if we are heading there, we are way too behind on the European side of the equation, right? I mean, we are years away from providing any capabilities that would be sufficient to take care of our neighborhood. And what we are doing is we are investing in rhetorics. We are talking instead of actually delivering capability. So, and this is where I have a big problem with strategic autonomy. I know that this is one of the, this is in official EU text, but this suggests, first of all, it makes us sound like it's bigger than it really is. Secondly, it's autonomy from whom? Well, there is one guy around, or country, US. And then for countries for whom security is a very real thing, right? It's not a theoretical question for Estonia or for Poland or for Romania. We know that US is absolutely critical for European security, and therefore we get, frankly, a bit freaked out about with talk of like this. I mean, I agree that where I think we would all agree is if we can focus on capabilities, that's great. If we can talk about European upgraded efforts, that's great. But it has to fit into solving our security problems that will take years to address.
Of course.
Can I just clarify something? I'm not saying that a retreat to an offshore balancing position by the US is desirable for us. What I am saying is that it's important for us not to ignore that there is a significant opinion in the American debate that says that is what America ought to do, and let these freeloading Europeans, do more. And I have to say, I have some sympathy for that.
Right.
Yeah? And the thing is that we, I think, only become credible allies and partners in this if we say we understand this, and there are certain operations where we think we need to be able to do this. And that, to me, is the sensible core of the notion of strategic autonomy. In other words, autonomy to do the things that we ought to be able to do without calling in the Americans. Yeah? And that, again, it's crisis management. It's not major war.
Sure.
Yeah? It's for deterrence. It's for political reasons just as much as military. For deterrence against Russia, it's crucial to have the Americans there. But crisis management on our periphery, small to medium, we ought to be able to do that. And that is not an uncoupling from NATO and shouldn't be seen as such.
Absolutely. So this is I agree on this point.
Okay.
It's not the way we are framing debate when we are talking about European aircraft carriers and European armies. Yeah. And rhetorics on European side matters as well, right? Americans are listening to this as well, and also their response is not only unified response to Europe. I mean, then you have countries like my own, Poland, that is looking to Washington, who is telling Warsaw, by the way, you guys are spending 2% on defense, you are modernizing, we're going to invest in you. And it makes many people in Warsaw think, well, maybe we should just do the deal with Washington rather than care about the rest of the alliance. This is not my view, but this is debate that is going on also in our country.
Come here, go on.
Just one, I think we're a bit gloomy here. I mean, the first thing is to say...
Lift up the mood.
Yeah, the first thing is to say that 2% is not out of reach or impossible. That's about 50% less than the average during the Cold War. And during the Cold War, we had booming economies and things was, we were not, suffering from being in a sort of a constant arms race. So the notion that 2% would be somewhat unbearable and so on doesn't fly. There are already 8 allies that are 2% or above, including Estonia and all the Baltic states. And this is, I think, something that we have to admit as a starting point, that it is doable, manageable. The second thing is that we've turned a corner on that. I mean, in the last 3 years, we've added $41 billion to defense spending in Europe and Canada, and that is already making a difference on some significant capabilities that enable us to start looking into rebuilding a force structure that had been hollowed in many, many ways. So from that perspective, and the last thing I would say is that the Europeans, the NATO Europeans alone, are spending roughly 200 to 250 billion euro a year, which makes them a quite meaningful player in the defense field, no matter what. So in that context, the issue is how do we better organize it using the tools at our disposal in NATO or in the EU in order to get a bigger bang for a buck. But all of this seems to me within reach. We're not discussing something that is neither unbearable, unacceptable, or that would change our society or social model or fiscal model entirely.
I saw that you tried to take away the gloom, but I saw Alexander Graf Lambsdorff shake his head continuously while you were speaking.
That's not the argument. If I go to my voters and say, listen, we can achieve 2%, we were there in the Cold War.
You were at 3% during the Cold War.
I know we were at 3% in the Cold War. They will look at me and so you're an old-style Cold Warrior. And what about the school building that's crumbling here, and the library that's being closed, and the roads that are in terrible shape, which is true in Germany, by the way, contrary to what you might assume. It's about opportunity cost. It is not about the capability of an economy to generate 2% of its GDP and spend it. It's about the political opportunity cost, the projects you cannot spend it on. Now, before Michal gets nervous, I am totally in favor of moving to the 2%. Okay? But I'm just giving you my debate as a lawmaker, as somebody who goes back to his constituents. And the weakest argument I can possibly make is, well, when I was in the army in 1985, we had 3,000 tanks, we had 500,000 German soldiers. It was a wonderful time, let's go back there. That is not going to work.
Well,
why not?
Tell you, yes.
Can I ask, Alexander, but what about, so I'm definitely nervous, absolutely very nervous.
But you're Polish. I mean, that's part of
But you guys are not that much further.
Okay, this is going to turn out into a brawl here. Go ahead.
No, because the question is, okay, I mean, we are talking how it's Trump who is pushing us to 2%, but the fact is that Poland and all the countries on the border, it's President Putin who is pushing us to spend the 2%, right? Not President Trump. So the question is, is it not in the responsibility of the German political class to communicate that we live in dangerous times, in dangerous neighborhood? It's not only Putin, it's also ISIS, it's also China in the end, right? So that this is not a moment to relax and spend 1.5%.
Is that an argument, Alexander Graf Lambsdorff, that you could go to your voters with?
There's a fundamental difference between Russia, the Polish and the German view. In the German view, Putin, Russia, is sort of the successor of the Soviet Union, which has been occupying Poland for 40 years. From the Western German perspective, the Soviet Union was the country that eventually brought forward Mikhail Gorbachev, and we made peace with them, and to be anti-Russia now is being a Cold Warrior. We're back in the Cold War, old-style Cold War thinking. I don't think that's going to fly either. The point is, and Constanze said as much, we as lawmakers have to make the point that our German territorial defense today is undertaken by our enhanced forward presence in Lithuania. It is undertaken by our allies defending Estonia, Latvia, and Poland. But it's a very difficult point to make. I am willing to make it. I'm constantly making it. But what I wanted to give you is that my other 708 German lawmakers all face these questions in their respective constituencies, and nobody wants to be called a Cold Warrior. And Nord Stream 2 is much more popular than the 2% goal.
Yeah, sadly. Can I come in on the back of that, please, if I may? And I'll be a German now rather than an American. Look, it's really very simple. Alexander and I are more or less the same age. We remember when Germany was a frontline state during the Cold War. And we remember the nervousness and the anxiety that Germans lived under. We have this memory almost in our cultural DNA that the idea was there would be 3 weeks of conventional warfare and then things would turn nuclear and Germany would be a pile of ash. We have vivid memories of this. And the problem and Thomas Bagger wrote a beautiful, brilliant essay about this a couple months ago in the Washington Quarterly, is that in 1989, with the enlargement of the EU and NATO and Europe whole and free, we Germans, suddenly became from 2 nervous frontline states, we became a fat and happy reunified state surrounded by a cordon sanitaire that both enabled us to become immensely more prosperous and immensely more secure. And we outsourced our security to the periphery. And it seems to me that the message that we all need to make to the German public is not, this is what it was like during the Cold War, or, Putin, but look, other people are paying the price for our security and our prosperity, and we owe them. Yeah? And that is in our own enlightened self-interest, because otherwise we're going to be on our own in the middle of Europe, because people will be bandwagoning against us, as arguably they already are.
So Germans then, are you saying we have a false sense of security?
Yes,
absolutely.
completely.
Yeah. The German utopia is being a big Switzerland.
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
Yeah, really big Switzerland.
They got to work on the watches still. But
Ali, if I can chip in on this, and
yes.
I hate this to be too much of a inter-German debate in a way, because I think the issue is somewhat broader. To go back to your point about this is not about going back to the Cold War and the glorious days of the Cold War, I totally agree. But we also have to stop being naive and think that we are going back to the glorious days of the post-Cold War. I think that sequence is over as well.
Yeah,
the
exactly.
moment when we were expanding Europe, expanding our values, and that we had only partners and friends around us. Mm-hmm. This is not the case anymore. Sven wrote a piece for the conference, which was really pointing at that fact, and I think we need to put a word on the new situation, which is the new normal, and that new normal is not the one that was the 25 years that followed the Cold War. And then that is something that we all have to recognize. And by the way, there are a number of countries that have made that move, and you can see not only small frontline countries, but also France and others that are saying we are going to be at 2%, even if peace comes with a price. Right. So this is something that is happening, and we see that happening around the line. And I think there we have to be honest about it. And then, happily, I'm not facing voters, so it's much easier for me. Yes. But I would say one thing is that I think it's somewhat difficult to argue that the wealthiest countries, and I'm not speaking only about Germany here, in Europe, are those that are not meeting their targets. And I think there is a debate, because it is, I think, unfair to those that are maybe less developed, that also have immense requirements in terms of infrastructure investment and so on and so forth, to say, oh, you're good for the 2% because you're closer to the threat, but we can get away from that commitment. Yeah. And that is, I think, for me, when you look at the figures across Europe, it's troubling to see that some of the wealthiest countries that have the least deficit, the least economic problems, the least fiscal problems, are those that are lacking behind in that particular debate.
I think the solution, and I've given you all the problems that we're facing. I think a good friend, Wolfgang Ischinger, has come up with a very interesting way of solving the problem for the German debate. I'm sorry for talking about Germany here. But he said, well, let's not focus on these 2% exclusively. Let's look at our international responsibility more broadly. Defense, diplomacy, and development. And let's then move to 3%. Now, that's a way of sugarcoating the defense part by including the development and the diplomacy parts. And in the German public, we are trying, we've actually had it in our political platform, we're trying to communicate that way, but making clear, to the German public as well, that, as I said earlier, German territorial defense is now happening in the Baltics and in Poland. However, it's a very hard sell, given all the other tasks, and opportunity costs are what this is about.
I'm going to bring in the audience in just a moment, but Constanze Stelzmüller, we have moved past the Cold War, and in fact, says Alexander Graf Lambsdorff, if I go to my voting district and talk about Russia, I'm being perceived as someone who wants to revoke all times. What then is the biggest threat facing NATO today?
Okay, that's exactly where my thinking was heading as I was listening to you, because we haven't really articulated the new strategic framing. And it's the following. And in fact, the first part of my answer is rooted in the new American national security strategy. It's a framework of great power competition. And that is an American strategy, but we have so far failed to articulate what that framing means for Europe. And the truth is that Americans can, and I think that ultimately this fails, but America can say great power competition and try to ignore economic interdependence. We can't. Our territories are much more difficult to defend, whether by land or by sea. You just have to look at our boundaries. And we are existentially dependent on our economic, social, political connections with the world. That, to me, says two things. We need to be able to think globally, to manage risks globally, and address threats before they arise, far away, because once they reach our borders or reach into our territories, and of course we are now seeing those great powers, Russia and China in particular, but others as well, like Iran or Saudi Arabia, and in some ways even Turkey, in the way that it manipulates domestic minorities, reaching into the European project and becoming, or having already become, European powers. And the challenge for us, in other words, is to live in a world of great power competition, where the only way in which we Europeans are great power is our trade and regulatory power, and that's not insignificant, but it is not enough. We need to add the defense and security component, but because our borders are indefensible, we also need to add resilience. That, by the way, is the one point, and I think that the Estonian president, Kersti Kaljulaid, makes this repeatedly, is where the EU plays a really important role as a backstop for what NATO does for Europe. Societal, economic, and political resilience.
Michel Baranowski, quick.
Absolutely. It's always super hard to speak after Constanze because you're so brilliant. No, you are.
Well, it's a panel. We have to speak after one
absolutely.
another. Yeah.
So, I mean, I think one other step is, if what Europe does in the world of great power competition, I mean, since we are talking about NATO, one thing seems quite obvious. In a great power competition world, Europeans will have to be more responsible for European security at the very least,
exactly.
right? We haven't talked much about China yet. I'm sure we'll get to this, but
not really. We have 30 minutes.
But I mean, this is where if they focus over on Asia, we'll clearly have to do more in Europe. Plus, they might ask us to actually do something about military threats and other threats in Asia. So I think this is again this bigger picture that we need to be communicating to our voters. Everyone has seen Game of Thrones, so we should just keep talking. Winter is coming, and maybe they will understand.
Never seen an episode in my life.
Same here.
Coming on, just quickly before we go to the audience, I've seen a lot of hands already up. Clearly, this is a debate that a lot of contributors are in. Greatest threats, biggest threat facing NATO today?
No, I think we have a first to recognize that this great power competition is in itself creating a challenge for the alliance, which, because either you take the sort of historical look at the alliance of being very Eurocentric and focused on collective defense of the European continent, or when you take the second era of crisis management, I mean, we are again in something different now where we need to think afresh. And part of that is looking at the transatlantic bargain and how we work together, because my absolute belief is that in that environment, North America, let's not forget Canada for a second, and Europe really need to work together. I don't think we have all the terms of that effort to work together, but I think it is absolutely critical because, in a way, the issue is not that Russia is the superpower that the Soviet Union was, but it's an agile power that is able to deliver lots for a big bang for a very little buck in many ways, and that is a problem. We have China, which suddenly we woke up to the notion that China was not only an issue for the Eastern, for Asia Pacific, but was the more we start listing issues associated with China, the more it becomes something that we need to think about as Europeans and Americans together, and potentially as NATO. So that really triggers, I think, a real need to be looking at the environment as it is. And for me, that's, if I were to single out a single thread, is that we have to have open eyes on our strategic environment and then make the best informed decisions, look at the tools that we have that are not all military in order to address that environment.
Alexander Graf Lambsdorff, when we talk about the greatest threats, obviously military is not the only means these days. Quite on the contrary, cybersecurity, the German Bundestag was attacked repeatedly, going forward, fake news, bots. These are all within the framework of the 21st century warfare, isn't it?
No, absolutely. But I think we still do have the possibility of military threats. Nobody knows where the ballistic missile program of Iran is. Turkey is just next door. I mean, we are neighboring this country. Russia, we don't know what they are up to. We have the scenario paper from the IISS with certain scenarios there. If you look at countries that are not part of NATO but are between NATO and Russia, Belarus comes to mind as a possible hotspot, not threatening NATO's territory, but as a potential trouble spot. So there are real hard security topics that are still around. But I think the biggest threat when we talk about cyber and all of these things is, of course, a concerted and successful attack on our critical infrastructures, on air traffic control, on hospitals, on water supplies, all of these things. I mean, that's I think the most significant hostile action that does not involve military hardware right away.
Ladies and gentlemen, I can tell you right now, and my witnesses are right here, there are 50 hands going up. I can already tell you, looking at the time, obviously, I'll try to squeeze in as many as possible. That depends, of course, for you to keep your questions short. Please.
And us keeping our answers short.
Thank you. A comment
saying.
on adding development aid to a kind of equation, and this is basically agreement is understanding 0.7%. Even then, the German aggregate defense spending and development aid would be below 2% of the GDP. The only country who meets those both targets in Europe is UK. Question is about Turkey. S-400s, F-35s. Are we losing Turkey? Are we having Turkey as a member of NATO in 2 years' time? What to do?
All right, thank you so much. Please take notes because we're going to do a long route. Go right ahead. Yeah, you had your hand up first, and I'm going to this gentleman who's had his hand up, believe it or not, 10 minutes into the conversation. So obviously something very urgently that he needs to share with us. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. Teresa Fallon, Center for Russia, Europe, Asia Studies. We know that Europe is very divided on China, and we see how China can actually impact European strategies. But how does that impact NATO? Because most of the countries in the EU are also NATO member states. So are we seeing divisions within NATO already in regard to China?
All right, thank you so much. Gentlemen, I'm very curious.
Yes, Konstantin Eggert. My question is to Alexander Graf Lambsdorff and Constanze. If we take the debate about defense expenditure slightly further to all those opinion polls that show that, Germany doesn't want to fight for Estonia and that Donald Trump was more dangerous than Putin or President Xi, please give us a snapshot of what German public opinion, what Germany will be doing in 15, 20 years with this tendency, or it's a tendency that you think will pass.
Right, thank you so much. Go right ahead.
David Kramer, the 2% issue is not new just under President Trump. But let me suggest that if you have not liked President Trump in a first term on 2%, you're going to hate him if he is reelected in a second term. So I would suggest thinking a little more seriously about getting there. He's also struck a chord in Washington, and the Ischinger solution is not going to wash in Washington, I would say. My question is for the Ukrainians and Georgians in particular in the room. I would imagine this conversation has been quite demoralizing and dispiriting. What would you say to them 11 years after they were promised they were going to become members?
All right. Thank you so much.
Georgia.
We'll go by the order. I'll try to take you in as much as possible. Trust me, I see the hands. Go right ahead.
Jana Polirin, one of the reasons why the Americans don't like strategic autonomy has a kind of defense industry component. So wouldn't it be a solution to open up the European Defense Fund and maybe then related PESCO projects for third parties a bit more that would also solve the Brexit problem and make an offer to the United States how to participate?
All right, thank you so much. I'm coming to you. I see a lot of frustrated faces. I'm coming to you. Go right ahead. Yes, please, Mr. Brzezinski.
Ian Brzezinski from the Atlantic Council. One point on Congress. Support for NATO is an unprecedented high. 30 years in my career on this. But don't take it for granted. Because at a certain point of time, the themes that Trump has been animating are themes that previous presidents have animated and previous Congress have animated. So the question for Europe is, how do you lock in that support that's so high now? The question I'd like to ask is China. It was a big theme in the Foreign Ministerial, the NATO anniversary. It was a theme on NATO in our first panel here. What should NATO's role be in the West strategy for dealing with China, for helping to develop a constructive relationship with China, and how do we get there?
Right, thank you so much. Go right ahead.
Yeah, François Heisburg. It was said earlier on in this conversation that it was important to convince President Trump of the importance of the alliance. I think the importance part has actually been done quite well. The problem with Mr. Trump is that he doesn't understand what an alliance is and what are allies. Now, this is not simply a comment, it's a question, and that is, how should we respond if, or rather when, the trade war shifts from China to Europe, and when President Trump will leverage Europe's defense dependency as part of the negotiation in the trade war? How should NATO respond? How should the EU respond? Companion question, European Defence Fund. I heard the question which was posed. I put the companion question is, isn't one of the ways to resolve the kerfuffle between the US and Europe on the defense fund by opening up the American defense market to public procurement by European companies? Thank you.
We have 3-4 more questions, then we'll throw it back to the audience. Quite a bit to take in.
Andrew Mikta, just very quickly, I have to say, at a risk of talking out of school, I find this very dispiriting, that we continue talking percentages. You know, we're 5 years out of the invasion of Crimea. We're 11 years out of Georgia. Putin will not be deterred because we put Germany meets 2.0 or 1.3. This is about real military power. This is also about the reality that the US is structured for one major theater war right now and one side conflict. And rather than talking about percentages, I'd like for the panel to address this. In the event, if we're to believe what Minister von der Leyen was saying, which I think is true, that China is a rising peer competitor, we may be tracking for a kinetic conflict in Indo-Pacific. For extended deterrence to hold in Europe, if the Europeans are not resourced militarily to ensure that in the event there's a conflict in the Asia-Pacific, you'll be in a position where you'll be either extorted, or quite frankly, you may face an even worse contingency. And where I would like to see the debate, and I want the panel to address it, why aren't we talking about real military power instead of 1.2, 1.3, 1.5, or nonsense like these? These are political discussions. And just a side comment, and this is not criticism of the organizers, and Constanza does a wonderful job as both, you know, talking about the US discussion and European discussion. I would have loved to see an American voice, especially from the military side, on this panel, on logistics, on infrastructure in Europe, on access to rail, on all the things that we've been working on and made progress on. But time is running out. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much.
Yep. Bye-bye, Lo. I was wondering whether you could sell increased defense spending in terms of an increased China threat. but conversely, that all this talk about 2% is going to be out of date so quickly, because in fact the new 2% may in fact be 3% or more.
Thank you so much. Go right ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, just as I don't know whether I represent the government. I do not, as I'm in this moment, I'm not member of the government, but member of the governing coalition, and I just could join fully Alexander Lambsdorff's comments. Maybe I should add that talking about figures, one moment this 1.225 will not be not sufficient, will not occur, because we will have the 1.5, which I see is too few. But we should not to excuse it, but think about two things. The first is capabilities, and the second is as the SACLAND transformation. ACT Admiral Nielsen recently just stated exactly what you said, that where is the European component of taking the necessity of bringing European defense as part of NATO on a better level, including infrastructure, including provisions of having a movement of troops in a situation where we absolutely today are not able to do. So this is investment which is for the European Union a possibility to contribute. And if we remember to somebody, an American who cannot sit here because he has passed away a long time, the late Pete Rodman, I think he has written 30 years ago already, where he checked what the return of investment and European states in defense investment is and in US. So we have to think where the efficiency of the investment could be increased. And I think I would ask you, what would you see from the side of NATO? How could we do this? How far is the possibility to get the Europeans closer together? And what is the way to convince the acting US administration that it's not bad to invest money in a joint European pillar?
Right. Thank you so much. Now, I think we've been able to squeeze everyone, and thank you so much. My thanks to you for keeping it very precise. Throwing it back to the panel now. We have about 50 minutes. Should be plenty of time for you to address some of these very pertinent questions. Coming once.
The good thing with having a long series of questions is that you can dodge the ones you don't want to answer. But I would say, let me start with China and NATO, because I think it's an interesting conversation. It's a critical conversation. It's a starting conversation. It's a conversation where we're honestly not there yet. And I think the answer is, part of that conversation is more a broader transatlantic conversation on how do we handle China, how do we handle Chinese technology, where NATO has a bit of a side role compared to what nations do, what the EU does, and so on. So that's one element. There is a second element which is more NATO specific, which is to say, okay, in an environment where China is becoming a major player in the strategic realm, what are we looking at? What's happening with China in the high north? What's happening with China in the Mediterranean? The Chinese evacuated for the first time ever their citizens from Libya in 2011. Since then, we have a Chinese naval presence in the Mediterranean that is quite regular. What does that mean for us? So the issue is not so much how do we send NATO to the Korean Peninsula or to the Pacific, but how do we look at that? So, and then thinking through where is NATO in that wider debate? There are issues that are associated with technology. NATO has traditionally played a very important role in protecting infrastructure in Europe, in thinking through infrastructure, critical infrastructures. That was made in the old days mostly about hard infrastructure. Maybe today it's also about virtual infrastructure, and how do we think through that debate collectively. So I think that there is a lot on our plate. The issue is not to turn NATO into an Asia-Pacific alliance. It's still a North Atlantic Treaty Organization, but to think through and have a proper conversation on where are we in this picture, in a sort of supporting role to allow the US to be able to do its rebalancing act in the Asia-Pacific, while at the same time also looking at what's happening in our immediate environment with China and on the European continent. Second thing, on Georgia and Ukraine, I mean, the standard line would be to say, of course, the open door policy is still in place. And I would say two things. First of all, it's not only a statement. North Macedonia joining is a clear message of that, and that's happening. The second thing, and that was a very important moment to see that the alliance sort of continues to engage and expand with the partners. The second thing I would stress is the depth of the partnership, which is a bit of an untold story because we don't, publicize that much, but there are exercises with Georgia. I can tell you from chairing many NATO committees that there are so many formats in which the Ukrainians or the Georgians are there next to the Swedes and the Finns and other very close partners, and that is a reality that is happening today. Then, of course, there is the bigger political step of joining, and what does it mean, and are the allies ready to bring them on board, and that is not unresolved as we speak, obviously. Issue of third parties in the European Defence Fund and PESCO. Of course, this is one of the most sensitive issues of the moment. The European Commission and the EU for PESCO argues that there are provisions that are open to third parties. My message to them on that is to say, okay, put this to test. It might be true in principle. Now let's make it in practice so that we can alleviate some of the concerns to a point. But then I think there is another argument coming from the EU, which is to say it's EU taxpayer money, so it's essentially going to the EU companies, which is also a very strong argument on the other side of the equation. So we have to bring this together. For me, the critical thing is that effort goes into the direction of meeting our capability shortfalls and working very closely on that. Third one I pick is the issue of the points made by David and Ian about Congress. I think we have to be honest to say, those who believe that the 2% is a Trump issue that will go with Trump or and things like that make a big mistake. That's absolutely clear, and we have to be fully understand that it's probably one of the issues where there is a consensus on the other side of the Atlantic that we need to continue pushing for that. So that is going to be something that we can't completely escape there. Lastly, on Andrew's point about the figures, does it really matter? I would challenge you on saying yes, the figures matter because that is what is delivering the capabilities, the readiness, and so on. So the money matters, and then of course I agree with you that we also have to have in mind what we do with that money, and there. I think there are some good news, there are some less good news. I think for me, it's very interesting. One of the big tests of this year, a bit below the radar, is whether the NATO readiness initiative that was initiated by Jim Mattis will be implemented. I think it's a critical element. I was quite struck at the last NATO ministerial to see that only 3 countries, and unsurprisingly the 3 nuclear weapon states of the alliance, really committed to provide essentially a battalion, a warship, or an air squadron at high readiness. And high readiness, 30 days doesn't seem to me exactly high readiness. So here, I think there is a collective requirement for all the allies to look at those such hard military requirements and go to it, and in order to be improve or for structure and be more serious on that, including on critical infrastructure points. I made the point about military mobility in my initial remarks, and I think this is one element where we can deliver much more in order to be more efficient.
Constanze Schelsmüller, which questions would you like to address?
Well, one, I think that the point made by Jana and Francois, that we need to be more open-minded about the way we handle defense procurement and the defense industrial market, I think is very, very good. And it's a crucial way in which we can keep the Brits in the picture in European defense. I think that is something where the EU and the US both, I think, need to move away from their more hardline framings. On Turkey and NATO, I have to say I find this really difficult. I'll make a more fundamental point here, which is that I think it matters now more than it did during the Cold War how we are constituted internally. I think that it matters more whether we are liberal democracies with a small l than it did during the Cold War, when of course we had military juntas. Both the Turks and the Greeks were, for a long time, were run by juntas. And so I think that, in other words, the answer to the Turkey question depends on what happens with Turkey. My sense is that Erdogan has somewhat reached a critical point for him with the questioning of the municipal elections in Istanbul, and that this may turn out to be a turning point for Turkish politics, but we don't know that yet. The point on China, is that my sense, frankly, is that European strategic communities have become very alarmed about the role that China plays within the European project as a splitter, as a disruptor, as a country that essentially is insinuating itself and its geopolitical interests in very skillfully, although sometimes less skillfully, and that is something that we need to discuss not just in the context of European Union politics, but also of NATO. But that does mean that's not actually a military topic, at least not at this point. It is more properly addressed on the political side of the alliance, where, of course, we currently have problems between America and Europe, if we're honest. Finally, to those of you who said they're disappointed, Andrew and David, look, the truth is that I think most of us in this room agree, and particularly the Europeans in this room and the Europeans on this panel, agree that Europe ought to be doing more, must do more, and we spend, in fact, a great deal of our waking hours saying and writing that. So don't be disappointed with us personally. We're here because we assume that you know that we feel this way, and we're trying to point out the difficulties and trying to figure out how to overcome them. But the truth is that on Ukraine and Georgia, and that's going to be the last point I address, is that, again, how Ukraine and Georgia develop internally matters, but we have an enlightened self-interest in helping them do that. Yeah. But it's not enough to say that they contribute militarily, although that is very welcome and desirable. We also need to make sure that these countries transform in the way that the countries of Eastern Europe transformed when they joined NATO and the EU, or in fact before they did. But it's in all of our interests to do that, and I think that actually we're all of us playing a significant role in that, not least, I will say, Germany. I think that the German strategic community cares profoundly about the future of Ukraine. Yeah. And the Minsk process is deeply flawed, I'll concede you that, and the Weimar Triangle has disappeared. But I think that there is an awful lot of sort of country-to-country relationships with Ukraine in the EU that did not exist 5 or 10 years ago, that are quite deep, are very sincere, and that constitute in their entirety a form of signaling that is very clearly recognized in the Kremlin for what it is, which is that we're protecting Ukraine's right to choose, and Georgia's as well.
Alexander Graf Lambsdorff, your answers.
Well, on Turkey first, I think if you're sitting in Ankara and look to the northwest, you recognize you're in the customs union with the EU and you have NATO as the guarantor of your national security. I mean, you're hard-pressed to make an argument for leaving that. I mean, I don't think we're losing Turkey. I think Turkey's enlightened self-interest dictates that they stay in NATO and that they deepen the customs union with the EU. On NATO, I'm a bit more cynical than Constanze. I believe we have an interest in having them there as well. On the customs union, it's more about values and the internal development. I would agree with that. On Ian's admonition, we shouldn't take Congress's support for granted. We aren't. But what Constanze just said is true. I mean, we here are cheerleaders for NATO, for more defense expenditure, for a serious debate about strategic threats. But the United States and all of our other allies have been extremely successful in the decades after the war to turn Germany into a pacifist nation. And when somebody says, well, you know, the increased China threat might motivate Bundestag and our voters to spend more on defense. When you say threat in Germany, people think about the extinction of the bees. No, I'm not kidding you. That is the political reality in Germany. Or car emissions. Now, these are existential threats. And Konstantin, your question about what's the tendency, where are we going with this, with the German public debate? We are trying to turn it around, but it is really, I mean, we're dragging, what was the title of this thing? Pulling the cart uphill together, right? Dragging our cart uphill together. That's the job for the German political class. And here, I have to be now an opposition politician. When appearing in international fora, you will hear German members of the German government be very clear and very blunt about our commitment to defense. Internally, the Chancellor, I cannot recall a single speech by the Chancellor concerning the German armed forces to a broader audience. I cannot recall a single speech. At Munich, it's a different matter, because that's the global crowd. That's the strategic community. But domestically, talking about threats is extremely unpopular, except if it concerns the bees. So that's a political reality. You don't maximize your vote by talking about strategic threats. So I know that it drives our neighbors, Michal is already getting nervous, to despair. And I find it really fascinating that Radek Sikorski and Michal here, the Poles are admonishing the Germans to do more on military capabilities. I totally agree, but we are really turning a tanker around. And Thomas Bagger's essay, I can only advise you to read it if you haven't done so yet, really encapsulates this very, very well. So we're trying to do as much as we can. On doing things jointly, procurement, 10 years ago, the European Union passed legislation concerning defense procurement, doing more together. The report in the European Parliament was called the Lambsdorff Report. I happened to be the rapporteur. I will never forget the lobbying from member states against this directive. From France, I had a retired general who was working for one of the companies. Monsieur le député, la France n'abandonnera jamais son indépendance. That's a good impression. Monsieur le Général, je suis tout à fait d'accord, mais that's not even what we're asking. The Brits were the toughest. They wouldn't even agree to joint research because it wasn't an EU competence. And Finland was still traumatized by the Winter War. And it was no, seriously, I mean, this is the reality. When you move into military procurement, you move into the very core of national sovereignty. And national sovereignty establishments are, culturally not very close to this idea of pooling sovereignty in the European Union. And that made it very, very tough. And the directive is there. It's on the books. The European member states could use it, but they're doing it far too little. I mean, there are tools there that you could use, but that aren't really being used. And then my final point, Jana and François, defense markets, opening defense markets. I will not forget the saga of the air, how do you call this, Luftbetankung?
Tanker.
The air tanker. The A350 won the Pentagon's call for bids hands down, and it was kicked out of the US market in favor of the 777. So I think both sides of the Atlantic can improve there. We need in Europe to get our act together, but the Americans have homework to do there as well.
All right, thank you so much for taking a vast amount of question. The fate of the German bees is relevant, of course, in that regard. But it's true that the German debate is indeed
live in Germany,
centered around that. Michal Baranovsky, you're going to wrap this up, but before we do, because Turkey has come up a couple of times, and we have the Turkish ambassador to Estonia here, who has indicated that you would like 30 seconds to just address this one particular subject matter. I want to give you the opportunity since she's here, and obviously, sure, we'll do this with the microphone.
Okay, since there is no other Turkish voice, I wanted to say about, answer the question if Turkey will be in NATO in 2 years. Turkey has been in NATO for the last 67 years, and Turkey will be in the NATO as long as it lives, because NATO is the backbone of Turkish security, and Turkey is the staunch ally of NATO. Turkey has the second largest army in the NATO. Turkey is among the top 5 contributors to NATO operations, and also I think among the top 10 or 8 contributors to the NATO budget. So we will be there. No worry about that. Thank you.
So, now that we have been reassured of the Turkish commitment to NATO, Michal Baranovsky, it's up to you to bring this
Great,
forward.
and I don't have to. I will thank you, Ambassador. A couple quick points. I mean, when I listen to our discussion, I'm more and more sort of worried and have this feeling that we are running out of time, not out of the panel time, which we are, of course, that too. But we are in this still inward-looking discussions where we are losing time when we talk about military mobility. Hodges, for example, recently very clearly said, we've been talking about military mobility now for 2 years. Not much has happened. We should be talking about the spending, but we really need to be talking about capabilities, and capabilities. When I hear about the Bs, Alexander, I mean, what I sort of wrote down is like, aren't leaders there to lead also the public opinion? And you write that we have all some hesitation when we hear about, well, this is the joke to Constanza, so Germany leading. But yes. I think that's absolutely true. And as we are talking, UK is leaving EU. 80% of NATO spending will come from outside of the continental Europe after Brexit. So, and the Russians, Chinese are not relaxing. So I think we need to have. I want to leave us with this urgency on one hand that we very much feel being on the flank of the alliance. But last maybe point on China, because it's clearly came up so many times, and I think I think the Americans don't know what they are doing there either. When I talk with Americans, they tell me how they need to develop more comprehensive strategy toward China. We as Europeans are just waking up there. But I think what's pretty clear from also yesterday's sessions is that China and transatlantic policy strategy toward China, if we can develop this together, will be both the challenge, but also an opportunity for us to keep this alliance going. Whatever this means exactly, Ian, because I don't know exactly what it means, but it's clearly something that it's a challenge that comes with an opportunity of keeping going this another 70 years or something that we have left.
Ladies and gentlemen, dragging our cart uphill together, NATO at 70 and the Army of Europeans. I don't know about you, Michael Baranovsky feels more worried now than coming into this debate. I don't know about you, but all I can say is what feelings you will take away with it, it's up to you. But I can only say, for one, this has been an incredibly substantial discussion that we've had, a very, very upfront and honest discussion. And I think that's worth a lot in this day and age. Thank you so much to bring up this issue and to highlight, of course, the importance. Yes, 70th anniversary is a very important stepping stone and a relevant moment to be marked. But it's very, very clear that this issue is going to be with us for a very long time, and NATO's relevance is not going to decrease anytime soon, ladies and gentlemen. Michael Baranovsky, Kamil Grön, Alexander Graf Lambsdorff, Constanze Stelzenmüller, this is your applause. Thank you so much.